go. Take it away, Marianna. And
thank you very much.
I will unmute you, my friend. Hang on a second. Well, I've asked to unmute you. I don't know if it's actually going to unmute you. Why would it? That would be asking too much, wouldn't it? Anyways, you can continue, Marianna. I will work on getting Jonas's thing unmuted.
All right, so welcome everyone. So we will start with this paper by Jonas that is published in the Journal of Applied Ecology. And so in this paper, the authors present the case of the competition for forage fish between industrial fisheries and two species of marine predators, two diving seabirds, guillemots and razorbills, and they make the case for the Baltic Sea. So the authors talk about this trade-off and conflict between fisheries and the conservation, and how it is difficult basically to resolve this trade-off and this conflict due to the lack of knowledge on prey requirements for top marine predators, and basically how prey change over space and time. So the authors make the case also that it is really unknown how targets that are commonly used to ensure sustainable exploitation of fish stocks, like biomass, maximum sustainable yields, and precautionary approaches, are actually compatible with the predator with predator conservations. And so the authors here develop this spatio-temporally explicit mechanistic framework that then can be used to determine the amount of prey required for the central place forages, as these diving seabirds are, and how this varies between species and depends on the population size. So the authors developed this bioenergetic model by integrating information from breeding stage, foraging distances, time and energy budgets, and also include information on management targets for biomass that needs to be conserved. And these targets are produced by ICES for the area that is considered. So the authors then aim to detect the minimum prey density required for successful breeding for these two species, and if this depends basically on, is related to population size, and how species specific traits, in particularly diving and flying capabilities, influence this density, and if the fisheries management targets are sufficient for maintaining favorable conservation status of these two species. So then the authors set up simulations for this in this mechanistic framework, which is parameterized by empirical data that were previously collected, and test then different prey density scenarios. So Jonas, before we get into the details of your finding and in our discussion, would you tell us how data hungry in general, or in your experience, this type of energetic models that you have developed are?
Right. Hello, everyone, and I see all of you here. And I just have to say also that I have actually most, if not all, of the co-authors in this paper in this session as well. So there are many that can kind of reply on questions coming.
Oh, good. I've left it open so people can unmute themselves this time. I've decided to throw caution to the wind. So if any of the co-authors do have something to say, just please unmute yourself and make a racket.
Yeah, that's excellent. So at least Tom and Agnes and Natalie and PA I have seen here. So that's great. Well, I can say very briefly that, I mean, we're lucky to study two species that are quite well known in their foraging. So common guillemot especially, but to some extent razorbill also is a widely studied species, as many of you may know. So there is increasing amounts of kind of tracking data and breeding ecology data and other type of foraging data to build this type of model. So I wouldn't say kind of data availability was for the seabirds was the biggest problem with this analysis. I think it's a bit less known about the kind of fish distribution and in depth, and also fish distribution in space as well, and how that varies kind of within the season and within the kind of diel cycle, with kind of fish generally diving deeper in the daytime and coming up in nights and so on. So I guess those are kind of more uncertain in this case than the Seabird data here.
So, and how about also the your measures of all the energetics, like the field metabolic rates for different activities in the time budgets? Was that easy to retrieve from other papers, or like did you find enough information around?
Yeah, I think particularly for common guillemots, there are quite a few studies. We didn't do much ourselves on field metabolic rate, and especially kind of activity specific field metabolic rates. But I think, I mean, of course, you could kind of tune these type of models and improve them as more data is getting available. But I don't think that's the kind of major problem here. That's at least my opinion. My co-authors may have another opinion.
All right, so I'll pick actually on one of the things that you have said already, which was one, like a finding that I also found very very interesting. So you, like, there is the happy ending, let's say, in this paper, because you do say that the density of foraging of forage fish that is corresponding to the used fisheries management target is actually sufficient for a successful breeding in both guillemots and razorbills. So that was the happy ending. But I also noticed that you actually wrote that. So of course, in your model, you picked a mean density for of course the ISIS rectangle that was of course available, and so you do actually make a call for a better the word
spatial resolution.
Exactly. Thank you very much. Monitoring, that's the word that I was looking for better monitoring of the area, also like not also like on the exactly not on the spatial, but also in the vertical dimension. So because of course these two species they do have also different diving behaviors and diving capabilities. So it might be that like differences in the density in the water column might actually affect so the breeding also the breeding performance. So related to this. So I'll go first on a step back. So let's talk a little bit more about the results that you actually presented. So I was also very interested in another results where you show basically at which density the two species start to differ. That was very interesting, and it's something that I can actually recollect reading also in other papers. So basically, it was found that the minimal forage fish density required for successful breeding is 56 and 55% of the maximum sustainable yield for razorbills and guillemot. And you found basically that razorbills could breed successfully at a lower prey density than guillemots, but guillemots, when they reach basically their low prey density, would then rather sustain themselves than basically feed the chick. So they would then abandon the chick. So my question is, so why do you think that you actually got these differences? Where you got these differences from inside your model workflow? And so what are the energetic consequences and implications of these differences?
Yeah. I can start to say something, and then my co-authors can maybe add something.
Sure, absolutely.
But I think to start with, I mean, common guillemot and razorbills are relatively similar compared to me. I mean, they're raising their chicks. They're taking these. I mean, they have a quite high wing loading, both of them. So they have a kind of energetically costly flight, right? But then the common guillemot is somewhat more extreme than the razorbill. And the difference between them is roughly 30%, I think, so in terms of wing loading. And that pays off in diving capacity. So our observations on diving depth on these two species, Saraux, is quite different, actually. So the mean diving depth of razorbills is around 15 meters, and in guillemots, I can't recall now the mean depth of dives, but 30-40 meters.
Yeah,
like.
I went to check Tom's papers. Was around. There was this bimodal distribution. It was around 20 and 40, and then also over 60 and 80. The classic bimodal distribution of the guillemot. Yes.
Yeah. But clearly, I mean, this cheaper flight in the razorbills allow them to commute longer, apparently, and that's something that is. I mean, we see it in the empirical data, but we see it clearly in the model as well, that they can make longer trips and still make ends meet in the energetic calculation. So I guess that's. And especially when they're feeding chicks, we have seen. I mean, in other places, razorbills may buffer, and I mean, they may take several food items per trip. That has been seen, at least in some studies. In other studies, they behave similarly to guillemots. They take one fish per trip, and in Saraux, they usually take one fish per trip. But even then, they can fly slightly longer as long as they get this one fish and then fly back and still make it. Whereas guillemots, as soon as the prey is moving away from the colony, their limit is kind of tougher. And then, of course, if they only have to self-maintain, then they can be out of the colony for very long times and dive deep and find some of these last prey, the guillemots. Whereas when they commute back and forth during chick feeding, kind of razorbills have a sort of competitive advantage in our model, at least.
Any of the other authors who want to add to what Jonas is saying, please feel free to speak up or write in our chat. Yeah, I also was I actually thought a little bit. So basically, guillemots during their when they are like feeding the chick are really sort of forces. This is really best for them to actually forage closer to the colony. But I was also intrigued now connecting all the components basically of your model, because you have a different the different components. You have the breeding, the population numbers, then you have the breeding status, and so the energetic, and then you add also the component of the prey of the prey density. So is this type of a framework that you have built also, of course, like is suitable for answering questions related to climate change, like for example on how climate change might affect prey, not only prey distributions, but also prey size and also energetic contents, basically of prey size, of type of prey. That's what I meant.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, one of the reasons we started with this is that, I mean, I was curious. I mean, in fisheries management, I've been in the kind of fisheries management type of environment for quite a long time, and we used to talk about this BMSY and BLIM and so on, and that's like a number, a ton, which is usually very large because we have these large fishing management areas, and I mean, we were curious to scale this down to what does this correspond to in kind of an area density or a volume density, and that was one of the starts to. And actually, if you scale down even a big number like 400,000 tons, but then you distribute it out over a deep sea and a large area, then the resulting density is not very high actually. And I think in the Baltic Sea is a very productive area. So we have this eutrophication, the kind of nutrients coming in from all over the place and kind of feeding this ecosystem constantly. So I would guess, I haven't done this analysis myself, but I would guess that the kind of the density, our density, BMSY density of fish is quite high compared to many other areas. So I think our result that BMSY is enough for the seabirds may not be true for other colonies, even of guillemot and razorbills, because I would be quite certain that the volume density corresponding to BMSY is different in all different areas. That would be an interesting study to do, actually. I haven't started looking into this myself. I would be keen to do it.
I was also thinking, like, for what you have said, so of course, I mean, also again for the number that you actually had, that was corresponding, of course, to just the area of the ISIS rectangle. In your discussions and then in your conclusions, where you say that a way to also go forward is actually to keep monitoring, basically, also densities, local, let's say, if you want to call them like local densities, to actually then capture actually what you have said, like all the different nuances and the differences in the distributions, basically, of the prey. No, absolutely, it's really fascinating. But yeah, I do not know if actually marine spatial planning is actually going toward this direction. For what you have read, or
I mean, I don't think it's unrealistic. I think it's the way we're moving, at least in Europe, towards this kind of multiple goals and kind of trying to have some kind of ecosystem-based management where you take into account various kind of components of the ecosystem and try to kind of manage not single goals as is done in fisheries management today, but also take into account, for example, top predators. But that clearly needs another type of spatial resolution of the management, and it also needs other type of data than is collected today. And to do a little bit of a spoiler, or whatever you want to call it, so another reason why we started this modeling is that since 2 years we are monitoring the fish abundance around this colony with a type of drone, a sailing drone that goes back and forth. So it's also a way to start putting in these empirical numbers that we get on the fish abundance just close to the colony and a bit further away and so on, into some kind of framework to start looking at seabird consumption, for example, and see if the model results make sense empirically and the opposite. So I think there are new technologies, and it's possible in the future to start kind of accounting for these different ecosystem roles of forage fish, for example. But I think management, at least in the Baltic Sea, it's not there yet. Perhaps in some other places. I know in South Africa, for example, there is a little bit also this type of movements of saving local prey stocks from industrial fisheries and so on.
Right.
David or Grant, if you have any questions or you want to take this further.
Well, David, I'll hand it over to you if you have a quick question, and then we can open it up to the audience.
Yes, yeah, super interesting, and maybe two points. One point, and actually your paper links very well with the second we'll be discussing today, where we'll see that in other systems things are by far not as going as well as your study system in the Baltic, and that's always a surprise to me. Because I studied along the Baltic, and in the lectures at the time, we were told how poor the ecological status of the Baltic was, as you said, with eutrophication, which might be a boost for primary productivity, but also brings all these dead zone, etc. So my perception of the Baltic was rather of a trash place. So I'm really surprised that the seabirds are doing so well, and that obviously there's always plenty of fish for them to feed on. So can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean it's completely true what you're saying, I think, and it is sort of a trash place, but even kind of dumpsters attract some birds like gulls and so on,
That was a good analogy there.
Maybe that's the best analogy, I don't know, but I mean clearly in the long term, primary production has increased, and also forage fish production has increased because of eutrophication. But then if you're a cod, it's not as fun. So I mean, it's depends. Yeah. But maybe seabirds are the ones who have really benefited from this, or at least seabirds.
And the second point, again, we'll see, looking at the two papers, that in your paper, you're taking a very detailed approach at especially at bioenergetics and the modeling, and then on the paper led by Claire Saraux, we'll discuss afterwards, it's much more macro, also because we've been looking at different marine ecosystems, and hence there's an interesting discussion about the level of detail you want to put into a bioenergetics model. So I saw that you did a sensitivity analysis in your study, and I was wondering, while doing this, did you see that at the end of the day, there were all chunks of the model which could be set aside, because sometimes you spend ages parameterizing stuff, and in the end the incidence of what you've been calculating is minute. At least that's my experience with the cormorant models I was doing a long time ago. So I was wondering whether at the end of the day there could be a slightly more parsimonious approach to what you're doing, or you think that this level of complexity is necessary to really understand what's going on at the local level?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I mean I think also another paper worth mentioning here is your paper in Current Biology that takes this very global approach, also with the bioenergetic side of it. But I think for sure that there are ways to simplify this, and that's absolutely the way forward, because here we're starting with extremely well-studied species like common guillemot. There are a few that are and that's of course unrealistic to get this much details on. I can say that what some of the parameters that are critical are the metabolic rates, the activity-based metabolic rates. So I think, and those ones are, I mean, sort of difficult to obtain also. I mean, at least it requires a lot of experimenting and so on. So these are hard to kind of
I think it's probably difficult. Yeah, it's probably difficult to have both sides, because you need some precision, but at the same time, if you look at a global level, and especially in terms of management in developing countries. It will be very hard to have that level of detail on a worldwide scale, but we'll see afterwards that, of course, there are drawbacks to a macro approach. So difficult to twitch all boxes.
Agree.
So Tom Evans had his hands up there. Oh, he's just commented down in the chat, and Thomas said,
yeah. So it's just.
Oh, there he is.
Sorry. Yeah. Hi.
Sorry, Tom.
Hi, Tom.
Hello. Yeah, I was just wondering. I mean, so the Baltic Sea has gone through a number of regime shifts, and there's quite a lot of research about that. And generally, no, I think Jonas will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's seen now as being largely bottom-up regulated, so it's more limited by the plankton availability, determining the numbers of the sprat and herring, which the guillemots and razorbills are feeding on. Whereas in the past, there was more top-down sort of predator regulation, partly more cod, more seals, etc. So in that sense, sort of as David says, yeah, in a sense, it is a relatively depleted system, perhaps, but perhaps it's depleted in such a way that it's actually benefiting these species, razorbill and guillemot, that are dependent on a kind of mid-trophic level kind of prey.
Cool. Thanks, Tom. I'll have one question here really quick, and that's basically, so if you told the fishermen that they could fish 2/3 of the prey out of the ecosystem, would that actually happen? So like, do you see an increase in fisheries pressure over time in this area, or is it relatively constant, and will it be relatively constant?
I mean, the thing that has happened with the industrial fishery, I mean, I can talk for ages about this too, but it's a quite small industry currently that makes a lot of money. So I think they settle on a relatively low fishing rate that gives them a lot of revenue still, and it's not open for any new fishermen coming in. So it's very far from some kind of bioeconomic equilibrium. It's more like a kind of very profitable state for a few fishermen, and that I cannot. That is, I think, because of that, it will likely remain approximately like it is today, even in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, cool. All right, I'll open it up to questions from the audience if anybody's got any. Dimas, I think I saw you waving your hand there at the screen. Yeah, I thought I did. You can unmute yourself, Dimas.
Hi, hello everybody. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm just very quick question, maybe a little bit slightly out of the topic, but it seems that the Baltic, despite or because some anthropogenic impacts, the forage fish densities are doing well, so are those seabirds. But what about the contamination of the environment? Because in many anthropogenic environments, we have like a high food abundance in many occasions because of eutrophication or other sources of food, but at the same time we have a contamination included or not good food caloric content. That's not the case because forage fish is great, and maybe forage fish is not very contaminated because they are pelagic and short life, not accumulating stuff. So what's the view about this relationship between food availability and contamination?
It's an extremely relevant question. I mean, the Baltic Sea has been hugely contaminated because of this. I mean, it's enclosed. It takes a very long time for the water to exchange. So for example, in the 60s, the PCB and DDT levels were like crazy, like compared to almost any other place. And that was also, I mean, one of the kind of longest time series of contaminants is guillemot eggs from Stora Karlsö. So they are very nicely tracked over time and have declined, of course, a lot, PCB and DDT. But there are other ones, that dioxins, for example, that keeps being on a relatively high level compared to many other areas. We haven't seen in the latest 10, 20 years any kind of harmful effect on the seabirds. A bit surprisingly, maybe. from these contaminants that are really quite high. We think they were affecting the bird. It looks like they were affecting the seabirds in the 60s and 70s, but hopefully, as it seems, not at this point, which is almost surprising, I would say. But they keep on doing well, and they have high productivity and high survival and high juvenile survival and so on. So, yeah.
All right.
That's a Baltic paradox.
Yeah.
Baltic paradox.
Yeah.
We should coin that. We should coin. It should be actually the Gremillet paradox. Now that you've or the Hentati Sundberg paradox. It needs a catchy name.
Too paradoxal already.
Is there any other questions from the audience? I'm not seeing anybody desperately raising their hands or throwing things at the screen. So I think with that, we will move on to the next paper. Jonas, thank you very much for joining us. And thank you for the paper.
Great work.
Very cool. Yeah, and I think we'll move on to Claire Saraux's paper. If you can, I will unmute you or ask to unmute you. You might have to unmute yourself, Claire. There we go. Hello, bonjour, how are you?
Good, and you?
Hi, Claire. Thanks so much for joining on a day where, you should have a day off actually. So, and at short notice. So, and thanks for joining Seabird Sessions. So I hope you'll enjoy that one and then join the next ones also. You're here because you're leading a big paper which just appeared in Fish and Fisheries. And you're based at CNRS in Strasbourg. The big question of the work is, of course, of the incidence of seabirds on prey stocks. And we know that this impact is generally small, and much smaller than that of, for instance, predatory fish, marine mammals, or fisheries. But the question is, are there instances under which seabirds may deplete a prey base? That's important in formal terms because we wish to understand the balance between bottom-up and top-down control of aquatic food webs. Bottom-up via primary productivity, notably under the impact of climate change, and top-down via consumers, including humans. So the scientific debate on this point seems to be everlasting. It was already a classic when I was a student along the Baltic. And that's a long time ago in a former millennium. In more practical terms, we would like to know how many fish have to remain in the ocean to sustain seabird populations. That was also precisely the theme of the first paper. And finally, the debate is also important in the context of fisheries recurrently accusing marine predators, such as seabirds, to be competitors. This is a well-known issue with respect to cormorant populations, for instance, both in Europe and in North America. So Claire and her distinguished colleagues looked at this issue in 5 marine ecosystems: the Norwegian Sea, focusing on puffins, Shetland with 12 seabird species, the Baltic, common guillemots, the Humboldt current 3 species of guano seabirds, and finally the Benguela upwelling, focusing on Cape gannets. They used a massive long-term data series on seabirds and small pelagic fish, some of these series lasting several decades. And they're calculating on one side what the birds were taking each year, and on the other side, what fish biomass occurred in the area at the same time. As you can imagine, this is easier said than done, and there are a number of tough assumptions about the calculations. Yet overall, they found that seabird predation pressure was generally low, equivalent to a median 1% of fish biomass consumed by the birds across all years and ecosystem. So top-down processes due to predation of forage fish by seabirds did not seem to control forage fish dynamics in any of the 5 ecosystems they considered. However, in 3 ecosystems, once fish biomass decreased below a certain threshold, and it was not the case in the Baltic, but it was the case in other systems. So once the biomass decreased below a certain threshold, for instance, because of climate fluctuations or overfishing, the proportion of the stock consumed by the birds increased sharply. And they found, surprisingly, this threshold was fairly consistent across 3 systems. It was at 15% of maximum observed prey biomass for herring caught by puffins in the Norwegian Sea, 16% for anchovies and sardines caught by Cape gannets in the Benguela, and 18% for anchovies caught by guano seabirds in the Humboldt upwelling. So there might be a minimum small pelagic fish abundance or availability to predators, below which those fish are called in what oceanographer Andy Bacon calls a predatory pit. That's when the small pelagic fish are being wiped out by seabirds. Interestingly, 20% of maximum biomass is often used in fisheries management as a limit biomass below which a stock should not fall or recovery plan should be put in place. The authors confirm a similar threshold from a seabird perspective, and they advise fishery managers to exercise due care in allocating allowable catches or fishing licenses at low levels of abundance. So thanks a lot, Claire, for this massive effort. And of course, there's a long list of authors and co-authors I won't roll out here, but everyone should look at the paper. And this paper is actually, if I'm not mistaken, a follow-up on the 1/3 for the Birds science paper led by Philippe Curie nearly a decade ago. So my first reaction when reading this paper, of course, you set up this paper in a seabird management perspective or also in an ocean management perspective, but I was slightly worried that at some stage, fisheries could turn the thing on its head and say, you see, there are instances where seabirds are real competitors with fisheries at low occurrences, and maybe then, some seabird populations should be down-regulated because they have an impact on sensitive fish stocks at low abundance. There are examples from the US, there are examples also from Switzerland. I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, but I don't know, I think in the paper it's pretty clear that it only happens when fish biomass decreased because of something else, mostly overfishing, could be also due to just climate change or environment, but this situation is not coming from the birds, it's coming from something else, and then the birds are actually predating quite a lot. And also the interesting thing for me was, because you talked about the predatory pit from Andy Bacon, but actually when we looked at whether the predation pressure from the seabirds affected the number of fish that would be there the next year, we never found any relationships. So the predation pressure was high, which could be worrying for the fish, but it seems that as most small pelagics, the most thing is recruitment. And because those fish are not going to affect the recruitment, it shouldn't really affect the population dynamics of the small pelagics. So yes, they do predate a lot in some cases, but doesn't seem to be affecting the recruitment, and doesn't seem to be affecting the dynamics after that.
Yeah, I think that's a strong point, and of course also in the paper you stress that especially for small pelagic fish in upwelling areas, there's a strong environmental stochasticity with wide-ranging fluctuations in the natural abundance. Which has nothing to do with seabird predation. The other thing I noticed in the paper is that for some systems, for instance, in the Benguela, you had access to small pelagic fish abundance through hydroacoustic surveys, so in situ measurements. And then for other systems, you relied on virtual population assessments. Are you, so to say, satisfied with linking up both data sources?
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly what you said with Jonas earlier. When you want to compare different ecosystems or different species, you have to make quite a lot of assumptions. So we used what we had. With that said, I'm not unhappy to have both, because I don't think that's really a problem. My main problem was, for instance, for the Norwegian Sea, where we know that seabirds actually consume only H0 herring, And so that's a lot of assumption because H0 then was derived from what would happen in the VPA. And we know that could be quite far-stretched. So for me, acoustic would be the best because that's really, we really know what's there. So having acoustics everywhere would be the best thing, but that's, as usual, you need a lot of surveys. It's really expensive, so we don't have that for a lot of places. So I don't think VPA is really an issue. It's more of, depending on the different edge categories, then you can have something a bit different from what you have with SSB, for instance.
And for the Norwegian Sea, this may explain why you didn't find really strong relationships?
Well, we found relationships, but we were surprised because in some cases, we found that seabirds were actually consuming the entirety of the stock, or even more than 100% in some cases. So yeah, we really think it's because the Norwegian Sea is a bit particular because they only eat H0. And so what we have from the fish perspective and from the stock assessment relates to the entire area, and they are spawned in a given areas and they go across the Norwegian Sea, and they are consumed by seabirds further away. So we have a big gap between what we're predicting as what's produced as H0, what arrives at the colony, and so the spatial thing that Jonas was saying is probably really important, and we couldn't take that into account.
Okay. And well, we addressed this already with the first paper. In for your calculations, you used allometric relationships, and I fully understand that when you're dealing with a suite of species, it's hard to detail their energetics. But I felt that one of the problems with allometric relationships is that sometimes well, for quite a few species, it overestimates energy expenditure. So I had the impression while reading your paper that, of course, you had quite a few species, but maybe a number of species where it would have been possible to detail the energetics species by species. Of course, it's not possible if you do all seabird species of the planet, but in your case, maybe you had 24 species, and you were probably just on the edge of being able to detail this species by species. But I wonder whether this was part of the discussions when setting up the paper. There were, I think, species for which you had more details, like in Cape Gannets, for instance. Yeah, I wanted to have your impression on that point.
Yeah, that was part of the assumption we had to make in some cases. But as you said, we discussed that a lot, and we decided that we would go for as much details as we had. So for instance, for the Cape Gannets, we had actual measurements of the metabolic rates, and that's what we used. For other species, we didn't have anything, so we used the allometric equations. So every species is a bit different in that sense in the paper, but actually I did compare, because at some point we wondered, because we have to go for allometric equations in some cases, should we do that for everyone so that everything is done the same way? But then we thought we would just lose resolution on the one we know better, so it's maybe not a good option. So we decided that each species would be considered a bit differently. If we had specific data, we would use them. If we didn't, we would use the allometric equation. But for those like Cape Gannets, where we had quite a lot of data, we compared, and I did some comparison. It's not in the paper, but what would happen if we had used the allometric equation, for instance. And it was actually fairly similar. I mean, it didn't change much the consumption. But then the other issue for the energetics was that at the beginning, I really wanted to distinguish between breeding birds and non-breeding birds because they don't have the same metabolic requirements. And that was really hard to find. I mean, in the allometric equation, you have a correction that we used, but to have actual field measurements and differences between the breeding and non-breeding birds was really difficult.
Yeah. And maybe that's slightly technical, but my experience is that the calorific value of the prey makes a huge difference. And then in a context where there might be a strong variability in the calorific value of a fish, I think that could change things completely. As has been demonstrated, for instance, for sand eels in the North Sea. There are big fluctuations. So my main worry, but that actually applies to all models built this way, is that actually the calorific values you take from the literature, and sometimes they're decade old, it might be completely different across time. So I think that's a potential bias, and really hard to deal with unless you measure this year by year.
Yeah, that's a good point. In the Humboldt, actually, we had a lot of measurements because Peruvian anchoveta is very studied, and we had a lot of measurement. It was pretty stable there. So actually, the abundance changes a lot, but the calorific value doesn't change that much for anchovy in Peru. But yeah, I agree with you. I mean, from my work in the Mediterranean Sea, we saw huge differences in calorific values of prey. I think there's not much we can do about that. I mean, I know in Europe, it's one of the indicators we propose for the MSFD, so the Marine Strategy Framework. And so like in the Med, for instance, every 2-3 years, we measure calorific values of the different prey to see whether there are changes, but that's not done in every ecosystem.
Okay. And maybe my last question before I hand over to Marianna, Grant, and the audience. So here you have a series of systems, and I wonder how you chose them. Is there a worldwide select club, 1/3 for the birds, and you have to get in, or do you as team leader then make your market and then go around the world and see what sort of data sets are available?
I wasn't at the origin. I mean, Philippe Curie created this thing that he thought we should look more into seabirds, fresh fish, and so he invited a lot of seabird people. I know when I joined the lab in Sète, Philippe proposed to me to come. I think Jonas, you came also after, no? You weren't there at the beginning. I don't know. We were lucky enough, I guess, to get invited, and so the original team, we'll say, looked for fundings for different meetings where we discussed questions and papers that we could address with the different data sets that were in there. But then, I mean, any data set could be added, and anyone who wants to participate is welcome. Like in this paper, for instance, the Humboldt has been added just because I asked Sophie Bertrand. She wasn't included at the beginning, but because we knew that. I'm also working on a paper on seabird survivals, a bit similar as the one from Philippe on 1/3 for the birds for breeding success, trying to look whether there are thresholds for survivors. We also asked anyone we knew had long-term data sets to join, so Saraux or different people. So no, it's just anyone who wants to contribute would be welcome.
Okay. Yeah, thanks a lot, and thanks for your great work.
Great. Marianna, do you have any questions for Claire?
I just have a very quick comment. It was really a great paper. So well done, really. I was also intrigued by this by the concept of where you were talking about the fish accessibility being also important rather than in addition to abundance. And I kept thinking I love bioenergetic modeling, so I kept thinking how really when we use this type of frameworks, we really need to take in consideration, especially when we go across the different species, where then the species is actually constrained. There was also a previous comment in our chat by Natalie. So some species are constrained on the horizontal plane, some others on the vertical plane, and so things might actually change, as you said, when you introduce also this accessibility issue problem. So yeah, great. Yeah.
Yeah, if I can comment on that, I mean, I think that's the main issue we have right now, because a lot of papers, when you want to compare, especially at global scales, you just use stock biomass because that's what's available. But as Jonas said, what's really important is what is around the colonies, what is the availability and accessibility for the seabirds. Yeah, that's my main thing I want to research in the next years, and we're actually collaborating with Jonas, trying to use the drones in different places and see whether we could have local densities around the colonies and try to understand that more. So, yeah.
Fantastic.
Very cool. I'll just ask one quick question, which might be it'll be a little bit less technical than that. And I mean, we're all aware of the issues and the arguments made against cormorants in North America about them controlling the system completely from a top-down perspective. Do you think that the lessons that you're learning from these models here would apply to that system as well? Are they comparable at all? Can you put the nail in the coffin to those people who are saying cormorants are eating everything?
No, of course no. No, I think I don't know. I mean, everyone is different. We found similar thresholds for the different species we were studying, but it's also quite similar systems which are mostly very productive, like the Benguela or the Humboldt. So we know that they're mostly bottom-up driven. It might be very different in other cases. So no, I wouldn't say anything for the cormorants.
Yeah, I think the key point is probably that in terms of optimal foraging, the giving up threshold of a cormorant will be higher than for other avian predators. So the prediction is that, you know, the threshold abundance at which they'll stop foraging on a patch is much higher. So that would plead, you know, in their favor. But that's probably all we have.
All right. With that, I will open it up to the audience for any questions. If anybody has any. I hear a car in the background, but I don't think that's... all right. I don't see any questions. David or Marianna, do you have any follow-ups for Claire?
Yes, and Claire, just to specify, so basically this paper, that's the ending of a process going over nearly a decade?
Yeah, I guess. Okay. To be honest, I think I presented this study in Cape Town in the last Seabird conference, and that was already going on for at least 1 or 2 years. So yeah, it took really a long time, mostly because we don't really have time dedicated. We don't have any project on this. And for myself, I was working at Ifremer, as you say. We don't have so much liberty, so I was really working on fish and couldn't really do much seabird. But yeah, it's still ongoing, and we still have quite a few studies that should be ongoing, but might wait for another 5 years. I don't know.
Yeah, and you were never tempted to include the Mediterranean in the study with, you know, small pelagics and shearwaters, or were the small pelagics already too depleted to look into these sort of things?
Well, no, I mean, no, I think it's interesting. Right now we are trying to include with Daniel Oro, so it's mostly seagulls. But I don't know, the thing with shearwaters is, I might be mistaken, but you don't have that long time series of demography, do you?
Well, there is at least for those breeding on Riu.
Okay.
20 plus.
So yeah, I mean, it would be good.
Just came from my mind.
As
you can select.
Jonas, you look like you were raising your hand there.
Yeah, I can just add to what Claire just said, that I think, I mean, as David says, this has been going on for 10 years in a quite low pace in a sense, but I think there are many unanswered questions, and I think, I mean, both the Curie study and this study by Claire and others showed the benefits also, pooling data from different systems and so on. So I think anyone who is interested in continuing some of this work and explore some of these questions should really touch base, because I think it's absolutely not a kind of closed network or anything like that. It's just good if others coming in with both ideas and data and to continue pushing this, because they're really crucial questions, I think.
Well, there are 40 people on the call, so there are at least 40 people who've heard you ask for help. So
yeah, well, the main thing is the fish usually, because there are quite a few places where we have long-term monitoring of seabirds, but we have no data on the prey. So at the beginning, I think that's why those ecosystems were selected, mostly because we had information both on the seabirds but also on the prey. But I've been really impressed by people are just really happy to collaborate and put all the data together. So it has been a lot of fun.
yeah, but good science takes time.
Very true.
All right, we are at 1700 GMT, so I guess that's about time to call it a wrap for the day, unless there's anybody who has any particularly pressing questions. Nobody's throwing anything or raising their hands, so I'm going to say that they probably don't. So thank you, Claire. Merci beaucoup. And David, thank you as always. Very lovely paper, Claire. And Jonas, thank you again. Thank you for
nice to see everyone
contributing and being on both of these papers. Yeah, it was nice to see everyone, and yeah, I hope you guys take care. We'll be back again as soon as we get ourselves together and get some more papers. We've been a bit lax on our schedule lately, mostly my fault for being a bit busy with life, but that's the nature of it. Yeah, so if you do have any suggestions for papers or anything like that, please feel free to email Marianna, David, or myself.
But we wanted to be back with 2 more guano papers. I think the next one, was it the plan?
Yeah, that's the plan. We got 2 guano papers lined up at some point in the very near future, hopefully for the next one.
That will be fun.
That'll be those will be loads of fun. I love talking crap. So all right, everyone, please take care, stay safe, and I'm going to stop recording now. So once I do that.